Hi guys, welcome to the chapter 2 of the SAS Certified Specialist Prep Guide, Base Programming for SAS 9.4. So in today's lesson, we will talk about SAS libraries. So yeah, let's get started. So the definition of a SAS library is a collection of one or more files that are defined, recognized, and accessible by SAS, and that are referenced and stored as a unit. So what does mean is that, for example, for Windows or for Linux systems, uh, a directory where there are SAS files is considered a library. So one special type of file is called a catalog. In SAS libraries, catalogs function much like subfolders for grouping other members. So yeah, there's a catalog as well. So a catalog is stored in a library and acts like a subfolder, so it contains other SAS files. So we will be discussing that in the future lessons. So for now, let's move on. So predefined SAS library. So by default, SAS defines several libraries for you. So this means that when you hit up the SAS Studio, for example, there are already libraries initialized automatically by SAS. So I had the on-demand academics logged in already here. So if you hover down to this library section at the bottom, you can see that in my libraries, there are already several libraries defined. So for example, the maps. Yeah, so here, the maps library contains several SAS files. So for example, the Afghani 2 dataset. So here's the data for the SAS file. Yeah. So here's the example folder, I mean libraries by SAS. So SAS Help, a permanent library that contains sample data and other files that control how SAS works at your site. So let's have a look at that a bit. So the SAS Help file contains several datasets that can be used for testing some of your codes. They're already predefined, and also this contains metadata files or views rather. So these are the views, the one that starts with letter V. Excuse me. Yeah, so SAS user, a permanent library that contains SAS files in the profile catalog and that stores your own personal settings. This is also a convenient place to store your own file. So let's see the SAS user library. So this is some sort of like your personal settings. For example, how do you want to set up your environment. So for example, in SAS Studio, you can define the window size, the fonts, for example. Then you save that as a file and you can store that in SAS user. So next time you hit up the session, those personalized settings takes into effect. Then last is the work library. So a temporary library for files that do not to be saved from session to session. So work library is something like a staging library wherein if you do not want to permanently save a file, for example, you create a SAS dataset, but it takes several data steps to create that, and you only need the final output. You can save those preliminary data steps into the work and the final dataset output into a permanent library. Yeah. So moving on, defining library. So to define a library, you assign a library name to it and specify the location of the files such as a directory path. So you can also specify an engine, which is a set of internal instruction that SAS uses for writing to and reading from files in a library. So essentially, we will discuss the syntax for assigning library name. So moving for now, this is just a description. So uh, you need the path, especially if you're working on Windows or Linux environment, and you can also specify the engine. So, for example, we had engine for Oracle database for Excel files. So, when you specify the engine, it helps us to interpret the files inside the library so that you can process those files. Yeah, so then when you delete a SAS library, the pointer to the library is deleted and SAS no longer has access to the library. However, the contents of the library still exist in your operating environment. So this means that when you assign a lib name, SAS has access to it, and when you deassign the lib name, the library is not accessible in this part, in the library section, but still the files are present in your Windows or Linux box. Yeah. So how SAS files are stored? So a SAS library is the highest level of organization for information within SAS. So as mentioned before, SAS library there are a group of SAS files in the same folder or directory. Then we can also have a catalog, for example, which can contain other SAS files. So they act like a sub directory for other SAS files. So here's the table that summarizes the SAS libraries in various operating systems. So for Windows and Unix, a library is a group of SAS files that are stored in the same directory. For ZOS, I am not really familiar. So it's another operating system. So it mentions that it's a specially formatted host dataset in which only SAS files are stored. So if anyone's familiar with ZOS, let me know in the comments. Then lastly, for storing files temporarily or permanently, depending on the library name that you use when you create a file, you can store files temporarily or permanently. So temporary SAS library lasts only for the current session. So what this means is that when you create a data set and you do not specify a library, the file will be stored in the work library. Yeah, so let's maybe show some example. Uh, where's that new program? F4. Yeah, here. So we'll learn about this in the future lessons. But for now, here's a sample temporary uh, dataset. So we will learn in the next chapters how to reference a temporary or permanent dataset. So for now, temporary means there is no library specified. So for example, test and another way is to reference it as work. So when we execute this, uh, what's that? There's an sorry, I highlighted only the test. Yeah, so when we check the library and work, the file test is here. So when I terminate this session, for example, I close this one and reopen, the file will not be available anywhere in work. So as when you close the SAS session, the temporary library and temporary files in it are also deleted. Yeah, so here let's check the work again. Yeah, so it's already gone, the test file. Then permanent SAS libraries are available to you during subsequent SAS sessions. So To store files permanently in a SAS library, specify a library name other than the default library name. So, for example, I'm clicking F4 to do the new program. So, let's say we create a library pointing to this path. So, I'll copy the location of that folder. So, we'll learn this syntax later. And we create a file. So, when you create a permanent dataset in a permanent library, so first you specify the library by assigning it. We will learn about this later, so but for now, just accept this one. So next is we create a permanent dataset in the permanent library. So to do that, we reference the library first and then the dataset name. So again, leave it up for now. We will talk about that in the future lessons. So when I execute this, I create a test SAS file. So it's a binary file. The extension is b dot SAS7b dot. And let's try to sign out again. And no, why did I sign out? I should have just exit the uh, no, yeah, I thought I logged out. I had to sign in again, but looks like it's fine. Yeah, so CC, I saved the permanent dataset test on the permanent library which we declared earlier, and even though we close our session and reopen, the test file is present. So it's really good if you need to have access again to those files. So for example, this is a report. This is the final output of your SAS program. You must save that permanently so that you don't have to recreate that every time, especially if the runtime is pretty long and there are millions of records, for example, you're processing. Yeah, so that's it for our lesson. So in the next lesson, we'll talk about referencing SAS files. So that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.